You will remember that in our first two lectures, we have primarily tried to understand how the state originated, and also we have tried to examine the different theories relating to the origin of the state. But our present concern is to understand the modern state as we experience it in our daily life. But we also have to appreciate the point that in order to have a proper understanding of the modern state, how the modern state arrived in history, we also have to go back to the past. That is, we cannot understand the modern state as it is today unless we first try to understand how the state has developed through time. And therefore, in this lecture, we will try to primarily focus on the history of development of the modern state. In this particular lecture, we will have to focus on the pre-modern phase of development. That is, the state, before it reached its modern phase, it went through a pre-modern phase. This particular lecture will focus on the pre-modern understanding of the state. Let us, however, take a quick look for our own convenience at the features of the modern state, the state as we experience it today in our daily life. Now, what these features are? Very broadly speaking, that is summarily, these features are: number one, monopoly hold over the use of violence. This is a very famous statement made by the great German sociologist Max Weber, who argued that state alone is the institution, state alone is the structure which has monopoly hold over the use of violence. Because if you defy the state, then you will have to invite penalty. Second, territoriality. That is, state operates within a defined geographical area. Third, sovereignty. The state is absolutely supreme within its territorial domain. Nobody can question the authority of the state. Number four, constitutionality. That is, the state derives its power from constitution. The state actually secures its sanction from the constitution. Number five, impersonal power. That is, the state is not in the personal possession of someone, whether it is God or whether it is king or whether it is queen. The state actually rules through law. It is a rule of law which actually guides the functioning of the state, which is manifest in the performance of the government. Number six, public bureaucracy. The state has a vast network of officials, administrative personnel who constitute what is known as the bureaucracy. It is through the bureaucracy that the state operates. So bureaucracy actually, in a way, it is the wing of the state through which the state makes itself operational. Number seven, the state actually operates by securing the consent of the governed. We are, of course, talking of the modern democratic state. We are not talking of, say, authoritarian state which does not accept any rule of law, which does not accept any constitution. So we are, broadly speaking, talking about the modern democratic states. So these states actually rule by securing the consent of the governed. That is, the state has to always be careful that it is in power, it sustains itself in power by continuously securing the consent of the governed. Number eight, citizenship. Citizenship actually gives legal identity to the citizens. And citizenship, in a way, has two very important aspects. One is that citizens, they can demand exercise of their rights to the state. And the states also, in turn, ask the citizens for obligation. That is, the state can demand obligation, whereas the citizens can demand rights. Finally, the last point, that is taxation. The state has the sole power, the monopoly power to collect revenues by raising taxes. So this then is, summarily speaking, the idea of the modern state. That is, the modern state rather, is characterized by these features. Now, as I have already stated, we are here going to discuss, in this particular lecture, we are going to discuss how the pre-modern state looked like, which was obviously quite different from the modern face of the state. Now this we will try to discuss on two levels. First, the non-European perspective, and second, the European perspective. And interestingly, we will say it in our conclusion that although we are talking of a distinction between non-European societies and European societies, obviously they are quite different. The geography was different, their history is different, their culture is different, everything is different. But ultimately we will see that whether it is non-European or European, there are certain strikingly common features just shared by the state in the non-European societies and the state in the European societies. Now, in the non-European societies, if we say take a quick look at some of the examples, say in the ancient Egypt, in say Central Asia, Mesopotamia, then in India in particular, say during the period of Chandragupta Maurya, or during the Gupta period, or later during the Sultanate, or during the Mughal period, and finally say in South America, for instance during the period of Inca civilization in Peru, what we come across is that all these states in the non-European societies were marked by certain very interesting features. Of course, as I have already said, as I have already told you, they are different culturally, geographically, historically, linguistically, they are all different. But there are certain strikingly common features. Now, what are those features? Number one, all these states were highly centralized. Number two, there was a kind of bureaucracy. Of course, not the kind of bureaucracy as we come across today in our daily life, the kind of sophisticated bureaucracy which we encounter today. But they had some kind of bureaucracy, some kind of administrative setup. Third, broadly speaking, they predominantly were ruled by or guided by, influenced by a notion of divine authority. That is, the kings, they tried to claim, they argued that they derived their authority from the authority of God. And also another very interesting feature, all these states more or less were guided by monarch. That is, monarchy was the predominant form of government in all these states. But eventually, obviously, the question arises why they collapsed. They collapsed because of disintegration, internal disintegration, then wars, then finally colonial plunder. Because of all these factors, these states ultimately collapsed. Now let us focus on the European perspective of the pre-modern state. So far as the European perspective is concerned, well, there were three major forms. That is, we encounter three major forms of pre-modern states in Europe. One was traditional kingdoms. Traditional kingdoms, primarily we refer to, say, the kingdoms of ancient Greece, then the Roman Empire. Now, during this phase, the kind of state that we come across in pre-modern Europe, well, it was a kind of state which very interestingly ruled but did not govern. Because in order to govern, the kind of structures, the kind of institutions that you require, that is a proper bureaucracy, that is, say, a kind of machinery which you require for raising taxes, these things were not there. They were there, but in a very, very crude, rudimentary form. So they ruled, but were incapable of properly governing their state. In fact, they were not guided by the principle that we have to rule by securing the consent of the governed. Then we come across the next form, the second form, that is feudalism, which lasted in Europe for about 1,000 years. Since the fall of the Roman Empire till the end of, say, the 14th century, Europe was ruled by feudalism. Now, what were the markers of the feudal state? The feudal state was, broadly speaking, marked by several features. Number one, in feudalism, the kings, apparently speaking, was sovereign. The king, apparently speaking, exercised supreme authority. But the king's authority was never stable. Never stable in the sense that the king's authority was always challenged by the authority of the church. So throughout Europe, we come across, during the period of feudalism, a tussle for power between the king, that is the royal authority, and the religious authority, which was controlled by the church. So this was one very interesting feature of feudalism, that is, there was a notion of dual authority. Second, under feudalism, we come across again another kind of very interesting feature, that is, there was a kind of hierarchy. The hierarchy was like this. At the top there was the king, and the king actually had certain vassals, that is the nobles, who actually were at the bottom. And the king actually secured the loyalty of the vassals, and the vassals in turn, the nobles in turn, they secured allegiance from the people who were controlled by the vassals. That is, it was a kind of authority which was divided authority, divided between the king and the vassals. And thirdly, well, this was the other very interesting feature of feudal Europe. That is, so far as the king is concerned, the king actually gifted land and the people to his vassals, to his nobles. And the nobles had, that is the local nobles, the local vassals, they virtually had absolute control over their people. And why did the king gift land and the people to the vassals? Because in return, the king secured their military support. So there was an authority, all right, but it was a very unstable, loose kind of authority. Finally, at the end of feudalism, and primarily this was the time, say, one can call it, or one can characterize it, say, about 14th century. End of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, around this time, a new phenomenon started to develop. This was the third form of the pre-modern state in Europe. A number of scholars like, say, Perry Anderson, then an Italian scholar, G. Poggi, well, they have identified that this particular feature as a remarkable characteristic of pre-modern European state. Although there is difference of opinion among the scholars that whether you can call this particular phase a break with feudalism, or it was a new kind of feudalism. Now this particular institution, this particular structure, it was known as Staatspolitik. In German, it was called Ständestaat. Now this Ständestaat or Staatspolitik, now what is meant by that? The scholars who have written on this subject, that is, as I have already mentioned, Anderson, Poggi, well, they argue that if we trace the history of feudalism in Europe, then we will find that a new commercial class was gradually emerging. This new commercial class began to emerge in Europe by the end of the Middle Ages, and this commercial class began to develop predominantly in the emerging towns and cities of Europe. And well, what were their activities? They were primarily engaged in commercial activities, in business activities. They actually represented the emergent middle class in Europe. And what were their aspirations? And it is precisely on this question that there is a dispute among the scholars. Dispute in the sense that some scholars believe that the kind of aspirations which were shared by these representatives of this new class, this commercial class, this middle class, well, that shows that they were already breaking out of feudalism. But there is also another opinion which says that it was actually a kind of structure which was developing within feudalism itself. So that controversy, that debate continues, that whether it was a break with feudalism or it was a new structure operating within feudalism itself. Now, let us go back to this question, that is, what were exactly their aspirations? What did they ask for? What did they demand? What were their claims? These claims may be identified as, number one, they were now asking for a larger territory instead of the kind of small territory which was associated with feudalism. Feudalism primarily was a rural phenomenon. Feudalism thrived around villages. Feudalism in Europe thrived around, say, rural society. Now, as production developed, as new developments took place in the field of technology and science, now this commercial class wanted to expand its activities. And in order to expand its activities, well, they were now demanding a larger space, larger geographical territory, a larger arena, a larger public sphere, where it would be possible for them to indulge in their commercial and business activities. That is, they were now arguing, they were now demanding that we have to transcend the narrow confines of village society, narrow confines of the kind of society, the kind of space which was which existed under feudalism. So demand for larger space, demand for larger territory, where it would be possible for them to indulge in full free commercial and business activities. So this was one thing. The other is, and that was very, very important, the second important demand made by them was this. That is, they wanted now a stable, strong, centralized authority. Because the kind of authority, I have already mentioned and explained it earlier, that the kind of authority which was there in European feudalism, well, this was a kind of authority which was divided. It was a kind of authority which was divided between the king, the church, and the vassals, that is the nobles. The king was there, but the problem is that the king was never sure of the stability of his authority. In other words, the king always lived under fear. Lived under fear in the sense that the king was always threatened by the rival power of the nobles. Because the nobles, actually what happened was that the different regions, say within a kingdom, the different regions, these regions were controlled by the vassals, by the nobles. And as a result, the king always feared that his authority, his power, his domain might be invaded, might be threatened by the vassals, by the nobles, over and above there was the authority of the church. The church fathers, the Pope, and Pope's representatives, well, they always demanded, well, we constitute the superior authority. We derive our power directly from God. And therefore, in such a situation, which was marked by divided loyalty, which was marked by, say, divided sovereign power, that is, in that sense, there was no sovereign power proper, because it was divided between the king, the nobles, and the church. So, in such a situation, which was extremely uncertain, which was extremely unstable, you will be able to understand that it was not really a very conducive atmosphere for trade and commerce to properly flourish. Because if in a kingdom, commercial activities, business activities, they have to flourish properly, then you require political stability. And political stability means you have to know, you have to understand, you have to identify who constitutes the central authority, the king, the church, or the nobles. That is, to whom I have to express my allegiance, to whom I have to express my loyalty. Who is my master? The royal authority, the king, the church, or the vassals, the nobles. So, in this confused atmosphere which characterized European feudalism, naturally the emergent commercial middle class, which the kind of structure that they began to develop, the kind of institutions that they began to develop, the kind of organizations that they began to develop, which I have already identified as estates polity or Ständerstaat. Well, this was a totally new phenomenon. It was a break, in a sense, it was a break with the traditional European feudalism. Well, whether it was a complete break with feudalism or it was a different kind of feudalism within the general structure of feudalism, well, that debate continues. But it was definitely feudalism with a difference. So, this then is the other form, that is the third form of European feudalism. But certain scholars have also warned that even if we consider it a break with feudalism, we should be cautious, we should be careful in our assessment of this estates polity. Yes, they were demanding new space, they were demanding centrality, they were demanding stability, they were demanding, say, central authoritarian power, all right. But still, they did not have a proper vision of the modern state. The proper vision of the modern state, which is characterized, say, by the notion of a sovereign power, which is characterized by the notion of a bureaucracy, which is characterized, say, by a proper mechanism, a transparent mechanism, a transparent structure on the basis of which you can collect revenue, you can collect taxes. Then a vast network of, say, army, police, etc., etc. Now, these things were still non-existent in this particular stage of European feudalism. As I have already explained to you, these are the three forms of European feudalism, that is, three forms of pre-modern state. And we have also seen that a kind of pre-modern society, kind of pre-modern state developed in the non-European societies. Now, to conclude, what we come across then is this, that in non-European societies as well as European societies, certain structures, certain institutions developed, which may be characterized as precursors of the modern state. That is, you come across certain elements of the modern state, but they were not yet modern. They were indicators of what the modern state would look like. But these were just certain clues to the understanding of the modern state. This is one conclusion that we draw. That is, you get certain traces of the origin of the modern state. That is, the demand for territoriality, the demand for a sovereign power, demand for stability, because modern state actually, it is based on the notion of sovereignty, it is based on the notion of a defined territory. So these things were there in the pre-modern phase, but not in a proper, developed, sophisticated form. So this is one thing or this is one idea that we derived from what we have discussed so far. The other point that we get here is this: whether it is non-European societies or it is European societies, there are certain characteristics which are common to them. That is, whether we look at, say, Asian states, Asian pre-modern states, or African pre-modern states, or South American pre-modern states, or whether we look at European pre-modern states under feudalism, what we come across is this: in both these societies, that is non-European as well as European, what we experience what we come across is the same emphasis on monarchy, that is kingship. Monarchy was the standard form of authority. Then the same emphasis on religion, divine authority. The same emphasis on, say, divided kingdom, divided loyalty. So, in fact, in the pre-modern societies also, there was always this problem faced by the king. That is, there were the priests, there were the godmen, they always posed a threat to the royal authority. So, there were differences, of course, between the pre-modern society in Europe and the pre-modern society in the non-European societies, but at the same time, there were also certain features common to them. That is, the same elements which were there in the making of the pre-modern society in Europe were also present in the making of the pre-modern state in the non-European societies. In the next lecture, what we will have to discuss is the rise of the modern state through a period of transition from pre-modernity to modernity. Thank you.